Hello, hello. We are at level 8 commitment devices. This I think is gonna be a little bit longer video than the previous ones, but it's very important topics that sometimes and for some aspects overlaps with a few topics that you cover with Professor Di Giulio. I mean, I was there when he was talking about limited rationality in Elster's framework, and indeed, commitment devices deal a lot with the framework of limited rationality and the role of abstract thinking in enhancing self-control for human decisions. So let's start with a clear example of what we are referring to. Indeed, if you think about procrastination, that's something that is related to commitment and to how induce people to have a correct evaluation of time and a correct discounting on the future and the progression of time. So procrastination is an issue. I'm giving you an exam. I mean, if I think about myself and I mean the agenda looks like overcrowded, it's full of overlapping decision. And I mean, if I think about myself at the very beginning of January 2021, when already there was a plan, an intervention I need to make on the 29th of January. For the record, I'm recording the video on the 26th. I mean, myself on the 5th of January was looking at the event on the 29th as something far away, and my projected self was sure that everything could be managed efficiently in terms of time management. But that is a linear self that projects time linearly in as a dimension, and this is not really the case. I mean, now is the 26th, and I realized that what I was supposed to make in order to arrive prepare at the appointment of 29 is not that prepare and manage. And this is actually the issue of procrastination that I'm sure all of us is familiar with. I mean, this graph is taken from a TED talk I will share maybe on Padlet, and is that TED talk is really related to procrastination. And this is a graph I like because it shows a 90 years old life of a human being. So all these square are week of a person living. So there are, each row is made of 52 squares, one per week. And I mean, these are each column, sorry, while the row are 90 like the years old. So this is the life of a human beings living 90 years old, and these are the weeks of a human beings living 90 years old. It looks always to me a very interesting and overwhelming graph, because think about all the decision we need to make and plan for such a crowded and complex period of time. If you think about each square in our agenda and calendar, you may realize how fuzzy and not visible the future seems to us. So I think it's a very good way to approach to the concept of fuzziness of future, of uncertainty. And I mean, procrastination, if I think about myself, is the typical way in which I watch TV series. And I mean, the typical reason why, I mean, the resistance to the sense of pain associated to procrastination um, was the way in which I watched Game of Thrones. Because season after season, I mean, I could not follow real time what was going on because I could not resist the temptation of waiting. And therefore, I waited for the entire series to come out each season in order to binge watch. And that is again related to uh, procrastination. Um, what do we say to the god of procrastination? Not today, but even not tomorrow, if you think about it. And now let's give an example of your life as students. If you think about, I don't know, there are 10 days left to the oral exam of environmental economics or whatever it is, to an exam you need to make. And I mean, think about yourself here or even before 10 days are left, and how would you like to distribute efforts in terms of study over time? That maybe is a kind of symmetric distribution of your effort over time. Efficiently, your projected self would basically like to distribute efforts over time. Sorry, Plato is here, and I just say hello, and I'm throwing him away. But what really happens most of the time that as we observe reality, most of the time we feel like that the entire effort is concentrated inefficiently on the very last day. I mean, this is a strip that you have seen everywhere, coming from one of my gods of the pantheon, Calvin and Hobbes. And the last minute panic is indeed my philosophy of life, and the philosophy of life of many human beings not able to self-control and to basically commit to something that they need to make in terms of action and decision. So, although sometimes we start with the best of the intentions, we often end up falling behind in our work. That is procrastination, and there are many ways of controlling for procrastination. I'm giving you a couple of examples coming from the history of literature. If you think about the role and the job of a writer, writing a novel is something that requires too much of the time we think about inspiration, but most of the time the role and the job of a writer is to be methodic in writing, and therefore deals with procrastination. So Victor Hugo, French poet and novelist, is famous. I mean, this is not legend, comes from the diary, because he had a peculiar method to avoid procrastination. He was very rich, so he had his servants stripping naked in his study and not return with the clothes until an appointed hour. And for that hour, Victor Hugo was supposed to have written an entire chapter of a book. The same applies to the great genius of Herman Melville, author of Moby Dick, and he actually asked for help to his wife because he asked his wife to chain him to the desk while he was struggling to finish such an incredible masterpiece but tremendously difficult novel as Moby Dick. And it worked. The book, first published in 1851, is listed as the greatest work of fiction ever written. Again, procrastination is something that deals with everybody of us, and it may be normal people or genius, and everybody of us, as you may observe in Victor Hugo and Melville, build up strategy to face procrastination. So I'm just giving you, let's bounce back into the future, because what we are mentioning is directly captured by this example of digital marketing strategy, which came out a few years ago on a crowdfunding campaign launch on Kickstarter that was collecting money for what you see here. That was the first version of, and at the time it was called Hemming-Wright. Hemming-Wright was a digital typewriter. So the campaign was, first of all, looking at a precise target, that of people of my age, so vintage nostalgia market. But at the same time, in terms of framing and in terms of commitment, was exploiting, actually, I think, a weakness of the product as if it was a strength, because Hemming-Wright was continuing to stress that when we write, one of the problems is absent-mindedness or being distracted. So Hemming-Wright is a digital typewriter, has no connection to the web. You can just write, which means that once you start writing, you will never end up to do what you are supposed to do. And I mean, it collected millions of dollars at the time, and now it's a product that is well sold, which I think builds, in terms of behavioral design, on the proper exploitation of referring to commitment. Indeed, and this is strictly related to what you have studied with Professor Di Giulio in environmental economics course, we have a present focus bias. And indeed, that comes from evolutionary biology by the early existence of human beings, that they needed to escape dangers. And I mean, they have very simple stop and go signals. We already said that. So we focus on what is present and we give more weight to immediate rewards rather than benefits that are seen as far into the future. And it applies also to cost, of course. So as long as we talk, for example, about cost benefit analysis, one of the big problem, and I think you went through that when talking about the Nicholas Stern review, the first kind of old review of the economics of climate change, one of the big issue was exactly the exact choice of the time discount rate. How much weight do we put in the future? How do we weight the future? And I mean, we look at Adam and Eve because the present focus bias is there. You give up heaven just for the sake of an apple. I mean, that is really what we are talking about. So let's make it clear with an example. If I'm offering you half a box of chocolate now, or an entire box of chocolate in 1 week from now, what are you picking up? You may actually answer according to your tastes. Many person will go for the entire box. Many person will go for the half box. When I am in class, I am there with a half box of chocolate, which is incredibly salient. But follow me in the next question, because if we look at the duration of a week, remember the squares in the overwhelming graph of the beginning. If we look at the duration of a week linearly, we see the distance between now and 1 week from now. And now is very salient. But what happens if I'm offering you one half box of chocolate in 1 year from now and an entire box of chocolate in 1 year plus 1 week from now? I mean, actually, this is pretty far into the future. And I'm pretty sure that almost everybody is clearly picking up the second option now. While maybe some of you in the first setting go for the now, in the second setting, you go quite clearly into the second option. And if you compare the two situations, they basically are the same, because you give one person half a box of chocolate now or an entire box of chocolate in 1 week from that moment. But what happens if we project that time 1 year from now? I mean, does 1 week now wait as 1 week next year? In theory, yes. In practice, no. Because of this present focus bias. If you think about the typical use of a smart box, this is exactly what is happening. Although we have an entire year to project our weekends with the smart box, most of the people, and this is a big component of revenues for smart box, forget to plan, and they basically arrive at the very last minute to use it, or they rebuy the possibility of extending the duration of the coupon. So if we go back into one of the big lessons that John Maynard Keynes left us, he said, and the sentence is much more complex, that in the long run we all are dead. So dealing with the structural uncertainty of the future, we know that in the long run we all are dead. That is clear. But an important corollary that we don't think that much about is that what happens in the day before the long run? Because we need also to agree on what the long run is. Because the problem is that we cannot see the long run till the very end. I mean, most of the time we project project ourselves as perfect, wonderful human beings. Think about yourself putting effort into study till the very end of the period you consider. So sometimes the big question is not when does it start the First World War, but referring to the great professor of history Alessandro Barbero, and also the Moai that were protagonists of our game in Redney, we need to ask ourselves, when does the eve of the war start? I mean, this is exactly what Professor Barbero does when talking about the homicide of Sarajevo in June 1914, that was the last moment of a process that started the First World War. But Professor Barbera says we need to ask ourselves what happened before, what gave the possibility of that homicide to happen, what were the preconditions that basically created the opportunity for a war. That is much more interesting for a social scientist. Now, story time again, because how can we deal with the issue of procrastination, of doing something that we don't like because we cannot really see the benefit but only the cost? I mean, I'm providing my experience as Iron Man before moving to Como, when I needed to iron my shirts on myself, and I'm super bad in ironing. But when I needed to, and that is something that I really didn't like to. I was not able to do that, and I didn't like to iron shirts. But since in E&I, in office, you were supposed at least to dress with a shirt, each week I had the problem of preparing my week of shirts. So typically what happened is that on Saturday or at the very last moment of the weekend on Sunday, I was supposed to iron shirts. And I mean, maybe it was better to iron a couple of shirts per time in order to efficiently manage the task. But I mean, myself as an Iron Man is not there. The way in which I was trying to combine the cost of ironing that was for me was painful with the benefit of having my shirts ironed was to combine the cost of ironing with something that produced for me an immediate benefit. That, in my case, was to watch the entire saga of Harry Potter again and again, the entire saga of Lord of the Rings, the entire saga of Sanseiya, the entire saga of Star Wars. I'm passionate of this movie, so one way was to combine the cost of ironing with the knowledge and awareness that together with ironing, I was going to reward myself with something I liked. And I mean, this is exactly the way in which it is called. We talk about actually to balance the hassle of ironing with the benefit and to let emerge the benefit of clean and well-pressed shirts. We talk about reward substitution. Accompany the immediate cost of an action with immediate rewards. That is a strategy, a coping mechanism dealing with procrastination, a behavioral element of the context that you may also consider to use when we think about a situation at our jobs for our video game. Because that helps balancing cost and benefit. I mean, commitment is associated to much more delicate behaviors. For example, voting behavior. How to make people vote. I mean, how can we induce people to vote? Because, I mean, you may consider that indeed is again an issue of sometimes pre-commitment and a reality that is different from the pre-commitment. Because if you ask people, are you going to vote in 3 months? They will say, yes, but then the day of election comes and maybe it's a great day. You want to spend the entire day at the beach because maybe the election in summertime, and actually you forget to, to vote. I mean, how to induce people how to change people voting behavior is an issue that, especially with the development of social platform, was there and has been studied through experiments. And when dealing with ethics in the very last next level, we will talk about the use of digital platform to induce behaviors, because there is a very nice paper that collected the results of an experiment run using Facebook for 2012 Congress election in US, in which, and now this is actually something standard, in which basically different settings of social messages have been tested in order to understand if the context on the social network was going to produce an effect on voting behavior. So think at your news feed on Facebook or whatever social platform is, and you see a badge showing up, this is election day, and then you may click on I voted and you see how many people voted on Facebook. But then also you see within your community of friends who between your friends went to vote. That is actually social pressure, and actually something that may commit yourself to do something. And this is really something that then has been applied all over the world in different elections, because it is shown that it produces significant changes in people behavior with respect to the fact of going to vote or not going to vote. We are not talking about what you are going to vote. Commitment is really something that IKEA uses in order to boost the attachment to its brand. And not surprisingly, this is called IKEA effect, because what really makes us fall in love with furniture of IKEA, it is shown that the fact of building up, assembling on your own furniture, really produces an impact on the attachment to that furniture. And that is strictly related to the issue of meaning. We are highly motivated to do things that we find meaningful, of which we recognize the sense. And not only the creation of something is important to determine its meaning, but also the attachment, the emotional attachment to that something. How can we test this commitment? Through the help of an experiment run in a lab. This is actually called Lego effect, and people were asked by the experimenter to build and assemble Lego Bionicles for money in different settings and conditions. So this is the kind of model. It is not exactly the kind of model, but to give you an idea, you are asked to come to the lab where an experimenter asks you to assemble with instruction the model that you see, one after each, and you are paid for that. And then you are observing how many Lego Bionicles and model you assemble, but in different settings, because the first condition, which is called meaningful condition, actually you go in front of the experimenter, you are given the first model, you assemble it, and you get paid $3. For the second, you get paid $2.7. If you want to build up a second one, then the experimenter asks you, are you going to assemble a third one? And you are paid more and more, so on and so forth. And all the models are assembled on the table. The finished Bionicle is in front of you. I mean, you see where it goes. And as more are built, they are collected and disassembled after the participant leaves. So this is called the meaningful condition, because you do something, you get paid for that something, you see the result of that something. What was the second condition? Actually, it was called Sisyphus condition, because it comes from the Greek myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a very bad guy that made Greek gods very angry, because actually he really pissed off Zeus, because he actually confessed, he revealed to Hera the fact that Zeus was cheating on her. And then he did much more, because Sisyphus basically kidnapped Thanatos, the god of death, which means that people never were not going to die anymore. And of course, even Ares, the god of war, was angry because nobody was dying in battles. And therefore, he pissed off lots of gods. Once gods uh, imprison Sisyphus, they actually charge him with an incredible, painful punishment and sanction, because he went to hell and he was condemned for eternity to go up and down from a hill, pushing a big rock, and when on top of the mountain, he was obliged to roll it down and start again and again. This is exactly the Sisyphus fatigue, is the metaphor for something that has no meaning and is incredibly painful. So let's go into the Lego experiment. How can we replicate the Sisyphus condition? Well, students are asked to build a Lego for $3, like in the first case. Then they're asked to build a second one, exactly as in the first case, for $2.7. But while they build the second, the experimenter disassembles the first. So you see that the object of your effort is disassembled in front of you. It's incredibly demotivating. And once you want to build the third model, you basically end up in assembling the first that you have built. So it's a sort of very unmeaningful job and task, because you don't see why you do that job. And if you look, when you compare the results in this experiment of people in a meaningful condition or in the Sisyphus condition, you observe that there is a very significant difference in the average number of bionicles assembled by the subjects, which, if we want to go into economic terms, means that the fact of being demotivated changes the reservation wage for people in the Sisyphus condition. What is reservation wage? If you remember from economics, reservation wage is the minimum amount of money you ask in order to willing to do a job. So the fact of being demotivated increases that amount of money, because you need to be compensated for that cost. Actually, it's interesting to show the fact that this experiment has been run with people assembling and disassembling bionicles, but there was also what was called the consultants experiment setting, in which people from outside were asked to predict behavior of people. And interestingly enough, people were able to understand that in the Sisyphic condition, you are going to assemble less and less models, but they are going not to predict on average exactly how many bionicles less you're going to assemble. So actually you finish to underestimate the magnitude of that effect. So you know that there is going to be a problem with the fact of doing something that has no meaning, but you're not correcting assessing that from outside. So the issue of motivation, meaning, is there in our everyday life. The fact of working on a project that doesn't come to an end is an issue. So E&I more and more is developing, like all big corporations, agile, leaning methodology that are based on team working, because sharing responsibility, working on prototypes gives you meaning for what you do. Otherwise, you risk to work for a project and a presentation till the very end, till the budget cancels out the project. So let's get to another way of inducing people to do something. This is a very abused word, but I think it's a very important tool, especially for people like us that are supposed to start thinking about game design. And now we talk about gamification. So using the logic of a game in order to induce people to do something. It may be to encourage people to work more and be more productive, but it may be also gamification in order to learn better. Think about the Kahoot quiz. Kahoot is a platform that I personally like so much because it uses gamification for learning purposes. Using the logic of game, competition, ranking, exactly for that, to induce people to do a quiz that typically is not something that students really want to do. So indeed, and these are all numbers, we are talking about a big industry, that of video games. So there has to be something with related to behavioral incentives for video games. 2.5 billion of people play video games, and in 2018, revenues of the industry were 137.9 billion of dollars. So for my parents, if I think as myself as a very young kid, old guy playing with Commodore 64, this was the way in which they looked at games and video games. Money, throw into the toilet. At the same time, if I think about digital distance learning, I'm really always focusing on what happens on the other side of the screen. For example, now, I don't know. I mean, you can watch the videos whenever you want, but I don't know what is the context. I want you to be engaged in what you do, which means that, for example, the video has to be watched when you can. And it's better, in my opinion, to use live classes in order to interact, because disengagement is a big issue and gamification may help on that. So there are other striking statistical associations just to put food for thought. It's very interesting to observe that in half a century, whatever is the indicator you use to assess cognitive skills of human beings, there has been on average an increase of 15 points. So people are more clever than before. But at the same time, if you look at statistics about suicides, there is a 60% suicides. I mean, correlation is not causation, but we are identifying a very complex world. In kind of paradoxical things happen. More clever people and more people doing suicide. So, and this is actually what is happening more and more for generation Y and Z. So games are important because they help us. Think about Duolingo, for example, in incentivizing correct behavior in experiences like, for example, learning. So, and gamification is not necessarily just related to video games and digital platforms. Gamification is something that parents know from scratch. Because if you want your child to start eating vegetables, that typically is something kids do not like that much, you may use games in order to let your child eat. That is a way of behaviorally designing the context in a way to induce a certain action. But I'm ending up with this part devoted to games because I already went on that. And this is one of the reasons why I like us to be involved in this project of video games, because what is really nice about video games is that, again, you can die all the time you want. Game over just means that you can learn from what you did wrong and start again. It's a very interesting and hopeful message for the future. It's a very good opportunity to learn and adapt to a context that changes very fast. So if we want to go into reward substitution from an experimental perspective, I'm now describing in a while an experiment that has been run in order to encourage patients, and I mean this is an homogeneous population of people that had an heart stroke once in their life, and they were supposed to take a medicine that was going to reduce the possibility of having a second stroke by 24 percentage points. So your probability of getting a second stroke is 50%. By taking regularly Coumadin, you may reduce that probability to 26%. But although the significant lower risk, and although the few side effects, the experiment, the doctors were facing the typical problem when you need to take regularly a pill. What is that problem? Low compliance of patients. So the question the experimenter, the behavioral designer, went through was, how can I encourage people to use more regularly Coumadin? And how can I use reward substitution? That will be our last question and last answer. So first of all, you need to measure compliance. It was kind of an old paper, but at the time, it was the very first time that internet-enabled pillbox were introduced. So this is a pillbox with a sensor, and all the time you open it up, basically there is a data point digitally coming to the experimenter saying the pillbox has been opened up. And the assumption is, if the person opens up the pillbox, it means he's gonna take that pill. So that is the way of measuring compliance. Having pillbox able to produce data points all the time you have the pill. And I think it's reasonable, the assumption that once you open the pill, you get it. Because, I mean, the problem of forgetting to take the pill is not really related to the fact of the hassle of opening the box. So, many settings have been tried in order to enhance compliance. You may pay people to be compliant. You may charge people. So, think about loss aversion. If you ask people to pay, and but this is questionable now to do that, you may induce people to be more compliant. You may work on their sense of guiltiness, maybe involving children in the experiment. You may work on competition. Let's make a tournament, giving a prize to who is more compliant than others. You may create obstacles. Let's say, and it happens sometimes now with all these IoT products, maybe you can block the fridge. If you're not taking the pill, you're blocking the fridge for 1 hour. You cannot open it. Or, and this is the typical way in which you use already a behavioral design in order to encourage people to take a medicine, cover pills with chocolate, make it sweet. The experiment, the particular setting that was tested and considered to be particularly efficient in order to enhance people to be compliant, has been developed by George Lowenstein, is a great behavioral economist, and Kevin Volk, working on regret and reward substitution. But let's get a little bit back on the many settings. So, if we consider the possibility of paying people to take regularly a pill, then you need to solve a second problem, because what I'm gonna pay, how much am I going to pay, and so what is the budget I need in order to enhance people compliance? So, what if we gave people $3 a day to take their medication on time, or $1,000 a day? Of course, it's a very different incentive, monetary incentive, and it's a very different cost for the budget manager. But you can try to inflate the incentive, and this is one first component of the experiment, with the principle of loss aversion. So what if prepaid people, so I'm giving you the entire money as if you take pill each day, and you are gonna give back money for all the day you are not compliant. And indeed, there is a significant increase of compliance, in this case, working on loss aversion. But the setting that worked the better was based on the combination of lotteries and regret. So people love lotteries. So another way of inflating incentives is to use a lottery. What if we gave people a 10% chance of making $30 instead of $3 per day, if you with certainty? I mean, what are we saying here? We are basically using the same money, because the expected value of a 10% chance of winning $30 is 0.1 times 33, which is exactly equal to $3 with certainty times 1 times 100%. So I can inflate incentives by introducing a lottery that augment the perception of money available. And then I'm combining that with regret. Regret is such an important feeling and emotion of human beings. if you think about regret, is the comparison between the situation when we are in life, that we face really in life, and we compare the situation where we could have been. Typical example, have you ever run to pick a train, to take a train, to take a bus, and you lost it for the very last second? Watching the train going out of the station, closing the doors in your face, that is an incredibly regretful experience, because you lose the train, but you have also the perception of how easy could have been to take the train if you just made something, a very small something differently. I don't know, maybe not stopping on the moving stairs. If you think about it, losing an airplane, a train for 1 minute or for 1 hour produces the same result. You lose the train. But it's very different, the perception, if you lose the train by 1 minute or by more hours. Because actually there is more ways of accepting the second option. And more specifically, there is less way of thinking about how different things could have been. So regret comes there, and regret is an incredibly powerful incentive for our action. So, I mean, I'm inviting you, if you have never watched Sliding Doors, that produces, with the amazing performance of Gwyneth Paltrow, the parallel life of the same person whose life changes according to a small micro event. I mean, the first version of Gwyneth Paltrow takes a tube, the second loses a tube for 1 second. I mean, regret is very important as long as we think, for example, as happiness or something like well-being in terms of positional goods. In economics, positional goods are goods whose utility derives not only from our consumption, but also from our confrontation with other consumption. I'm a collector of images of Olympic podium, and this is the image I always show. This girl, this woman, is Michaela Maroni, a US athlete, a great US athlete. She has won in artistic gym many gold medals in world championship. And this is the image of the day in 2012 in which she won the silver medal at the Olympics of London. It's an amazing picture because she's really, really, really pissed off. And if you go into collecting pictures of podium, especially when most typically when the race or the performance, the final result is really tight. So the first, the second, and the third are linked one to another. You will observe something like that. People not very happy on the podium. While, and this is actually the best way of representing through an example the idea of positional goods. The very first guy, the gold medal, is always super happy. Actually, the third medal as well is happy, the bronze medal. Why that? Because the third medal, positionally speaking, looks clearly at the fourth person, the guy or the girl that is left out of the medal zone. The second guy or girl, like Michaela, actually is incredibly pissed off if the race is very close. Why that? Because of regret. Because you can think of a slight change that could have made results different. That is regret, and that is a clear evidence that happiness is relative if you think about it, because although objectively second is better than third, on a perceptive dimension, we can discuss about that. The regret lottery combines the inflation of incentives through the lottery with regret. How that? Because all the subjects that need to take the pill regularly and are tested in the experiment get a ticket for the lottery, but then only those who took the medication on time have the possibility of claiming the prize if they are extracted. So you receive a phone call from the experimenter saying, congratulations, you have won your lottery. But then you are also said you have not been compliant in taking Coumadin, you are not taking the money. That is the combination of the lottery and regret. And I mean, in this particular setting, compliance went up to 97%. And this is actually reward substitution and the way of combining different way of incentivizing people to do something. So again, the effect of regret lottery compared to the control group was to increase compliance up to almost 100%. Now let's go back into commitment devices and what we have already called Ulysses contract. And I mean, Professor Di Giulio went through limited rationality framework talking about the history of Ulysses. Ulysses, wanting to listen to the songs of the sirens, is the typical image of rationality, knowing that you're going to be tempted by something and you want to prevent your something to fall into temptation. But with self-control contracts, you know that you're going to be tempted, like Ulysses here, and therefore you apply rational strategies to cope with that problem of self-control in order to be able to listen to the songs of the siren and not to be killed because you are tied with the tree and your mates have put something in their ear and cannot listen to the songs of the siren. So you know you're going to be tempted and you prevent your future self, remember the problem with procrastination, to misbehave by binding your present self. So getting back to the problem of a person, of a student that needs to concentrate, especially in this distance form, to study for the exams, one of the strategy you read on the web is to give your Netflix password, your social network password to someone that you really trust, your significant other, a friend, your mother, and you are not going to, you are preventing yourself to access the social network. It's a Ulysses contract because you know you are going to fall into temptation. And in order not to do that, you basically rationally apply a strategy from scratch. Actually, these a very good example in terms of behavioral design of Ulysses contract that has been introduced recently, I would say, in the operative system of smartphone is actually the modality do not disturb while driving, because there are so many accidents, these are statistics, of people that have accident with their cars because they are texting while driving or they are concentrating on the use of smartphone instead of driving. So this is a way of applying Ulysses contract. Or more simply, throwing on the back of your car your phone so that you know you cannot take it as long as a phone call comes. The example of Clocky is there. Clocky was this alarm clock launched by these US students on a crowdfunding platform collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars that again prevented the problem of snoozing, because when your projected self set up the alarm for the morning after at 6:30 because you want to work out, you want to have a great breakfast, you want to have a walk, but then 6:30 come and you snooze the alarm clock 5 minutes more, 5 minutes more, 5 minutes more. One way is to have a random walking clock into the room that helps you in preventing the possibility of snoozing. And now there are also apps that basically provide the same service digitally, because in order to stop the alarm to ring, you activate your system too by solving arithmetical operation. That is gracefully painful but very effective, because once you stop the alarm, you wake up. There are many examples of these. You can actually have fun. This is one of the one of the project I like most, because there was an association, a project that was linking your alarm clock to your bank account. So you basically stick to a program in which you say that if you are not going to wake up when the alarm clock rings, your money is getting out and you see that on the digital screen, and you need to indicate an association that you don't like, Ku Klux Klan rather than terrorist association rather than the football club that you don't like. I mean, that has been banned because of violation of human rights, but that was an amazingly effective way of inducing people to behave differently. You can go on the website Stick, because this is exactly a website based on commitment devices. You take an obligation in front of a community, and that community is going to be your peer group, monitoring the fact that you stick to the commitment. Okay? So let me go again more on a longitudinal perspective about the importance of commitment and self-control. There are all studies replicating in time that are called marshmallow tests that really want to assess if self-control is an innate characteristics, and if this is an innate characteristics, what consequences produces on human beings all over their life cycle. I mean, once you listen to the fact that you want to test if it is an innate characteristics, typically the subjects of this experiment are children. Let's see together what happens. If it works. Hoping it works. Okay.
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right.
So the task is easy. You leave alone one child with a marshmallow, and you say if you don't eat it, you get a second marshmallow once I'm back.
I'm gonna go do something and then I'll come back.
It smells yummy. It smells really good.
All right, so it's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay. All right, so I'm gonna leave and then I'll come back, okay? So you can either eat it right now or you can wait. Either way, okay?
You see that there is different ways of coping with the strategy of temptation, but also the resistance to temptation.
How'd you do? Did you do good? You did?
Yeah.
You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. So did I tell you to give you another one? Okay, now you can have both. You need them.
So what is important is that, first of all, even for children, you see that all of them have a strategy to cope with temptation, have a sort of intrinsic Ulysses contract. Because, for example, some people avoid to watch the marshmallow, some people try to distract themselves, some people touch it but do not eat it. So we develop, even when we are children, strategy to cope with temptation of not projecting our present self in the future correctly. But what is important of this study is that the marshmallow test that has been run first in the 60s of the 20th century and then run again uh, following longitudinally people in time is that better children in procrastinating, so people that are better from innate in discounting the future and procrastinating, perform better, and this is not fake result, at college. They are more healthy in terms of food regime. They less likely incur in criminal activity. And if you think about it, the association is clear because all of these activities require a sort of self-control. At college, you need to plan organize your study in a longitudinal perspective, in a multi-year perspective. When you eat, you have many temptations, and again, you need to decide strategically how much to eat. And of course, also the probability of incurring in criminal activity is associated to your ability to manage money and to be in need. So, if we ask ourselves if self-control is a skill or an innate ability, we need to also to consider how much important it is that innate characteristics in resisting to temptation. And now, resisting to temptation is a energy-consuming activity. And this guy, Roy Baumeister from Florida State University, talks about explicitly ego depletion, which is like to have a battery. When we are continually exerting self-control, we consume energy, and we are less likely to resist to temptation. So the experiment run by Baumeister, to consider our resistance to temptation like a battery that may be discharged. It was made with an experiment with students have been asked to come to the lab, and they were supposed to and in the lab there was on the table some vegetable or some chocolate bars, and then you needed to perform some game with words, puzzle, enigmistica, very complex, and then people were measured how much time they devoted to that games. I mean, not surprisingly, people that were supposed to face the temptation not to eat chocolate, there was less time to game than people that are in front of the temptation of eating vegetables. Because again, if we already consume some energy in resisting one temptation, you are consuming some cognitive energy of our brain, and we have less left out for our purposes. I am concluding this kind of long level, but it's important, putting up together what we learn in order to talk about such a relevant issue for media students, climate change and global warming. Because if we collect all we have said, and if we think about global warming from a psychological perspective, it's like the perfect storm of behavioral biases. Why that? I mean, if we think about global warming, first of all, it's very far in the future. I mean, less and less, but it's sort of far into the future, because even the most severe consequences are supposed to happen in more than 50 years from now, which means that none of us will be there. Maybe our children, most probably our grandchildren. So again, present focus bias. We cannot really see that cost in the long future. So how to frame global warming in a more effective way? We cannot identify the progression of climate change. And indeed, if something is gradual, we realize that it changes gradually. But if something happens, we cannot see that progression. That, of course, produces another problem of perception. and identification of the problem. Very important. It's not so salient the pain of people associated to climate change. Why that? Because although World Health Organization projects, I think hundreds of thousands of people whose death is associated to climate change, as our identification with that cause is fuzzy. Although, for example, if we have in mind the picture of, I don't know, 9/11 terrorist attack, we immediately feel the emotion of victims of a terrorist attack, of a violent attack. Floods are floods. Most of the people do not think about them in terms of climate change. But let me give you another example. Heat wave. 2003 has been one of the hottest year in record of human history. World Health Organization estimated that in France, 20,000 people have died because of the heat wave. But the point is, do we associate that number, that incredibly big number, with climate change? While if you think about France, for example, the dead people of the terrorist attack of Bataclan a few years ago were in the order of magnitude of the hundreds, more than 200s, but compare more than 200 to 20,000. There is a difference in order of magnitude of 10. Sorry, there is the doorbell, but I'm coming back in a minute. See? Here I am. So this is another issue to take into consideration. Then another problem. Individual efforts, when you think about global warming, seem to be useless because we cannot see directly the benefit of our individual behavior. That is one of the excuses people take in order not to do action. I mean, you feel very useless in all the complex mechanism of global warming, which makes less salient any action intended to change that context. So, in order to basically give a more positive message at the end of this class, actually, I'm on this of the school of thought of people that believe in human capacities to adapt, to find solution, and to be creative. This is not an easy way out. This is actually the development of our humanity. So I think that commitment devices and behavioral design is important in order as a tool together with others in order to make people more aware of a situation, more aware of empirical evidence, more aware of what is needed to be done. And in order to give a very positive message, I always remember people the story of the Salt March. The Salt March is considered by many historians the beginning of the independence, of the reachment of independence of India from the British Empire. The Salt March, 1947, has been called by Mahatma Gandhi, and I don't know, if you go into the story of the Salt March, nobody was sure that it was going to be a success. When Gandhi said we are gonna, by walking, collect salt on the Indian Ocean to protest against the British Empire, nobody was sure that that was going to be a huge demonstration of participation. Actually, the small groups of people that started the Salt March was really a bunch of people. And then more and more that they were going along the route, more people joined that group. And hundreds of thousands of people finally arrived on the beaches of the Indian Ocean. But the point is, what is called prophetic minority, most of the time doesn't really know that, let's say, 50% of the population is with them in their battle. That is why they are called prophetic minority. A prophetic minority does something because it is intrinsically motivated to do that something. And then when the critical mass of the population supporting that cause is there, the process becomes irreversible. The good thing is that critical mass models say that you don't need 50% plus one of people to be with you, but a critical mass of people that most typically is between 20 and 30%. But still, creativity, motivation, commitment, and intrinsic motivation are very important in giving us the possibility of hoping for a better future. Okay, with this very last sentence that gives me the possibility of applying for Miss America 2021, hoping for peace and love for everybody, I'm inviting you for the last level of our course. Ciao!